quickly here and turn this over to the great Ethan Nadelmann, founder of the Drug Policy Alliance. And Ethan, over to you.
Thanks, Charles. And actually more relevant for current listeners, host of the podcast, Psychoactive. So I hope you're all tuned into that. So Charles asked me to join this. I've never given a talk about burnout before. But I've thought a lot about it, and not so much for myself. I mean, I was involved, and I have been involved in advocating to end the war on drugs and advancing harm reduction vis-a-vis illicit drugs for about 35 years. You know, during that period, there's been a lot of successes and also a lot of disappointments. And for me, I've been in a situation that's quite different than many, if not all of you, tuning into this, which is that I came from a fairly privileged position of being in an elite university where my salary was paid, and then being able to, build an organization and raise money from very wealthy guys. So for me, the greatest issues around burnout were really around dealing with annual budgets and fundraising, and especially dealing with an ever-growing staff. I mean, there's sort of problems that I think many of you wish you could one day have, and they're difficult and they're challenging. But I don't think I ever, I didn't experience major phases of burnout, sort of a week during each summer when I'd ask myself, how much longer do I want to do this? And then when I finally got to a point about 6-7 years ago where I realized that it might be time for me to step aside, I was able to plan it out. But in the role I played, both building my organization and playing a role in building a broader drug policy reform movement that included a lot of grant making and allying and assisting lots of grassroots activists around the world, not just in the U.S., but globally, I perceived and learned a few things, I think. I want to share that. And I want to put it in the context, really, of what it means to be, building a movement of ultimately aiming to win and doing it in as constructive a way as possible. So, I start off with the presumption that one of the great advantages that all of us have is that, I say all of us, I'm assuming all of those who are advocating for harm reduction vis-a-vis licit or illicit drugs, tobacco or other drugs, or even fighting for human rights, whatever in that area, is that we know without a doubt that we are on the right side. I mean, it's almost like we're religious missionaries, except we got the science behind us. You know what I mean? I mean, the fact of the matter is when you're advocating for harm reduction, the science is there. We know we have it. We know that the large majority of the scientific consensus, to the extent there's any objectivity to it, is behind us. We know that we have information that makes sense. We know that the opposition to harm reduction, the framing by our opponents, no matter how powerful they are, the World Health Organization, the Bloomberg Foundations, all of the other powerful entities that are pushing this stuff, that we're on the side of right and justice, right? So we have the science on our side and we have the human rights on our side. And that means that, although there are little things around the edges where we have to stop and, check ourselves and ask certain questions, it gives us this great advantage. It means that we can look our kids in the eye at night and say, I'm not just out there trying to make an extra buck. I'm not out there trying to screw somebody. I'm actually there trying to make this a better world and save people's lives and advance public health and science and human rights and compassion. And that's an incredibly empowering position. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the value of being in that position. So that's start off. I mean, that's a great advantage we have. The other side may believe in what they have going for them, but the fact of the matter is they have to engage in a lot more cognitive dissonance, given how much of the scientific evidence is on our side and how much of the human rights side element of this thing is on our side. Now, the second thing I would say is, and some of this is advice as much about advocacy as about avoiding burnout, which is that as I was starting, a few friends of mine suggested, this is as I was shifting from being an academic to getting involved full-time in activism, a few friends of mine suggested I meet with a fellow named Ram Dass. Some of you may have heard of him, sort of a spiritual guru guide, came out of alternative thinking about drugs, but also the kind of guy that, corporations would pay a lot of money to come and talk at their annual retreats. And I went to see him and I told him I had this great opportunity now to get into full-time activism. I'd secured a major donor and I asked him for his advice. And he said to me, he gave me two pieces of advice. And the first one was, Ethan, you need to learn to love William Bennett. Now, most of you probably won't know who William Bennett was, but William Bennett was the first drug czar in America in 1989 at the height of the kind of hysterical drug war, highly punitive, evil drug war. And William Bennett, to my mind, represents kind of pure evil. I mean, this is a person advocating death penalties and mass incarceration and promoting all sorts of vicious lies. He was almost like the Putin of the drug war as far as I'm concerned. And Ram Dass is saying to me, Ethan, you want to succeed, you have to learn to love him. And I kind of laughed, but I knew what he meant, I think, which was that for us to win, for us to prevail in our advocacy and changing the political and legal context and public context, it means that we have to win over the people, not our most virulent opponents, but all the people who are worried about what it is we're saying, all the people who worry about their kids getting into smoking, all the people who think this is only about us being shills for a tobacco industry when in fact nobody's getting any money from them. I mean, all this sort of stuff. But it means that element of empathy, of having this sense of empathy for people who don't get right now what we're trying to advocate for is absolutely pivotal. So just keep that first thing in mind, right? There's our opponents, but then there's the mass of humanity that's really on the fence or ambivalent or leaning the other way, and they're really who we're trying to reach on this thing. The second thing he said to me is, let go of your attachment let go of your attachment to the goals that you're fighting for. And what I took that to mean is that win or lose, committing hours, days, weeks, months, years of our life to this cause, whether or not we ultimately prevail in our lifetimes, it's still the right thing to do because we're fighting the good fight, right? We're fighting the good fight. So don't despair if we're not making progress. Just know that you're involved in the good fight. Now, that said, the question becomes, if we're involved in the good fight, how do we increase the odds we actually win? Right. And that where I think the most important thing, is basically understanding that as we begin to build a sort of movement, as we're doing that oftentimes the most difficult challenges and the most frustrating things and the things that get us most angry oftentimes aren't our opponents or the establishment advocating for all this anti-harm reduction, anti-human rights type stuff. It's our allies. It's the people we agree with on the broader objectives. It's the people we fight with over tactics and strategies and girlfriends and boyfriends and funding and credit and all of this sort of stuff. That's almost in the nature of things. That it's the people who are working right next to you or that you see all the time that you're becoming allies with them, not because you're necessarily friends, but because you need to work together. And that's what I think is absolutely pivotally important to basically, the expression, keep our eye on the prize. It's a phrase from Martin Luther King. Keep our eye on the prize about victory, what victory means. And it means that, part it means in practice is the less time you spend getting involved in disputes over tactics, strategy, principles, whatever with your allies, the better. I would always tell my staff, don't get involved in all these little debates on Twitter or email or whatever it is about little this and that and definitional things and language things like that. Forget it. Let people debate on that sort of stuff. Let's keep our eye on the public facing strategy. Keep our eye outward. Keep our eye looking, in that sense that we need to stay focused and minimize, all of that, internal stuff that's not actually changing anybody's minds out there. And then the last thing I just wanted to say here was that, the question becomes, how do we engage in elements of sustaining ourselves? I mean, if you can stay in this cause, it's going to be a multi-generational struggle. No question about it. Just, I sometimes think about the struggle and the war on drugs is, maybe a 3-generation struggle. And we're now kind of into the second generation of this thing. And we've had some big victories like in marijuana, and we've managed to spread illicit drug harm reduction. We managed to roll back incarceration in my country and a bunch of others. But long way to go. So you want to think about this in the long term. And that means being willing, really to obviously take care of yourself. I mean, other people will probably say this, but, we can get passionate about these things and we forget to go outside. We spend our whole day in the apartment without ever going outside. We forget to take a break. Sometimes, it was a saving grace for me that often, just spending from Friday night to Sunday morning, just not doing anything about drugs or thinking about the work, just having a concrete break, a Sabbath, the beautiful idea of the Sabbath as applied to, our advocacy work, right? I mean, it's what you need to do, to just take that break, find something different. As sometimes you'll find yourself just getting tired of just saying the same sorts of things. So doing that sort of thing, but it's also at the same time, sometimes I would evaluate my mental health by, on the weekend, how much time did I spend engaged in unpleasant thinking or emotional angst about my work, right? It was fine to think about drug policy and all this sort of stuff if it was fun thinking about it, talking about it. But to the extent it brought up feelings of anxiety, I needed that time where I would have 36 hours a week or something where I could just disconnect myself from that, so I could take a breath and distract me, do something else, and, be with my daughter, or, go to just something other. But the last thing I want to say is that, when you're committed to advocacy, each one of us is a different personality. I mean, we come from different places politically. We come from different places in terms of our broader, the way we interact with people, what we like to do, what we don't like to do. Some of us are good at writing, some at speaking, some are better at arguing, some of us are shy. I mean, you name it. There's something about advocacy where you should think about it, I think, in two different ways. One is that how do you take what you and hopefully others see as the strengths of your personality and use those to advantage in your advocacy? What are the things you're good at? What are the things where you can carve out a niche that can be useful to others? How do you play to your strengths in a way? Because obviously playing to your strengths enables you to build on things you're already naturally good at. And typically that's a case of not feeling burned out from that. But then there's a second piece of this stuff, which is, what about the areas you're not good at? What about the areas that don't play to your strengths? What about the things that you're afraid of? Well, here's where being attached to this greater cause, which I regard as a blessing, any of us involved in these movements, it's a blessing to have this type of emotional, political, principled connection to a broader cause like this. Well, the question is how do you use that commitment to help push yourself out of your comfort zone? How do you do it to try to grow in your personality? If you're somebody who's shy, how do you find the opportunity to actually be a little less shy, to force yourself to speak publicly, to force yourself to reach out to politicians or journalists where you might not even think to do it because you're asking, why would you do that? If you're somebody who's highly argumentative, well, here's the opportunity to sometimes step back and say, I love arguing, but where can I try to cultivate my abilities for communicating in non-argumentative ways, whether it's with allies or whether it's with the broad, outward group that we're trying to influence? There's looking at those opportunities to grow. One thing I knew is that as the opportunities emerged for me to go from being an individual academic advocating for reform to build an organization, a political movement, I was called on to do all sorts of things that I had no experience on and that I never thought I had any gifts for, whether it was raising money or managing a staff or meeting budgets or, a whole host of things. But, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. What you realize is if you want to succeed in your own life and if you want this broader movement to succeed, well, that means stretching yourself, getting out of your comfort zone, being willing to take criticism and digest it and think about it honestly and be willing to do stuff you never imagined you were doing because that's what's required to build this movement. So I'm going to stop there and I look forward to joining the Q&A at the end of all the other presentations. Thanks a lot.
So thank you so much, Ethan. And I really want to compliment you on on your podcast, your new podcast, Psychoactive. It's actually incredibly interesting, well worth listening to for anyone. Ethan, I'm going to ask my question, and then Jeff is going to help us with a question from the audience. Ethan, one of the first policies of this new administration in the United States, which is, I mean, it's just one country, was a strategy on drug harm reduction. And this is primarily focused on opioids because we're in a huge panic over opioid use. And the president himself in the State of the Union address 2 nights ago actually said the words harm reduction. And the fact that that's happened, I think, is in part due to your work in the past and the work of the Drug Policy Alliance and thousands of advocates that you helped to energize at the DPA. That's fantastic. Another area where we've seen some progress in the drug harm reduction space is in the use of cannabis and cannabinoids. And so the kind of pointed question I want to ask you is about how did the cannabis community, which is not my community, but I have nothing against it, how did they react when the idea of medical marijuana was first introduced?
I mean, it's basically, I don't know how much it goes to the theme of burnout, but I mean, basically there was really a split. I mean, there were some people who thought that medical marijuana should move forward totally independently of broader marijuana legalization and dissociated themselves from broader marijuana legalization. There were other people who had been advocating for marijuana legalization who did not like the kind of incremental medical marijuana strategy. They felt that it might peel off the most sympathetic victims of the war on marijuana and that it would, maybe put things into a medicalized framework that would ultimately put things backward. And then there were the people like me who, fortunately, we had the resources, who basically saw the medical marijuana thing in through both frames. We saw it as something that sort of stood in its own right. And we believed that those people who are using marijuana medically as opposed to purely recreationally had a moral right to be first in line to obtain the legal right to use cannabis without fear of the government's, putting them in jail. So we thought that, but then separately, we also thought that opening up the public discussion around medical marijuana, where we already had majority sympathy on our side, would help to change the broader public dialogue around marijuana legalization. And we thought that was likely the case, and it turned out in retrospect to, in fact, be the case, that by opening up a broader dialogue on medical marijuana, it changed public opinion much more broadly. But I mean, Charles, just to the theme here, we had to be conscious around this stuff with medical marijuana because sometimes the most powerful advocates were people who were living with multiple sclerosis or living with AIDS wasting syndrome or other conditions where marijuana was really like a lifesaver for them. It was helping them to keep moved, to reduce their pain. And we wanted them to be out front. But sometimes that imposed a real strain on them. I mean, to have somebody who's dealing with MS, be wheeling into a legislative hearing or things like that or advocacy thing, it galvanized them personally, but sometimes they would just be wiped out after that. And so it's understanding, sometimes it's like when we think about, what happened with the Marlboro Man commercials and when then he has cancer and he becomes one of the great ads, right? The Marlboro Man with lung cancer, right? Well, if you think about it, having a comparable ad of somebody who was struggling and then is saying not just stop smoking, but vape instead, but you have to be aware that sometimes people are, who are already sick, they're your best allies. They're the ones who most pull on the heartstrings that people are otherwise opposed to you. So you want them out front, but you also want to make sure they're not actually driving themselves into the ground.
Yeah, I think, so advocates feel burnout when they feel like they're not making progress. And in a way, so part of my question is just like, how did those human stories help tilt the needle? In my opinion, that was a very important way to actually harness evidence and put human stories into the public discourse. So the public saw people, the journalists saw.
Well, I'll give you one example, Charles. I remember a very powerful op-ed. It was written, I think, by a Korean American woman whose mother was dying in the hospital. And everybody, even the physicians, were saying, use cannabis to deal with the nausea that you're dealing with and some of their symptoms. And she said, I absolutely refuse. I will not go to my death, using these drugs, right? And died a more painful death, and maybe a death that was a little sooner because she was in such pain and discomfort, right? Well, it's the same thing if you think about the advocate who can, who can personalize this thing, who can, the person who is dying of cancer and said, I wish I had the opportunity to do this thing. The child who lost their parents to cancer, this U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, who should be on the right side of this issue, is on the wrong side of the issue. He goes, I'm against this issue because my parents died of lung cancer. Well, my dad probably died of smoking related disease as well, but it puts me on the other side. So it's kind of that stuff. And it's the humanizing element of this thing. Now, we had that with medical marijuana. I remember with advocating for needle exchange. We had somebody who lost her father to, I think maybe actually a Miss America or maybe a Miss New Jersey winner or something like that. Or somebody had lost their father to AIDS from injecting drug use. And she was right out there saying needle exchange could have saved my life. Hard-ass Republicans, when we were working to reform these very punitive drug laws, we brought in the kids of the people who were incarcerated to say, why is my parent in prison for longer than rapists and murderers are when all she did was sell some drugs to another adult? Why did she get 20 years and not a couple of years? Why isn't she home with me? So it's those sorts of things where you kind of, you can even pull on the heartstrings of the most callous people who are out there. And I mean, Charles, the fact of the matter is when you feel like we're making no progress or that we're banging our heads against the wall, ultimately reform, it's about incremental. It's one person at a time. It's one journalist at a time. It's one politician at a time. I think one thing that most activists fail to do is to realize that there's no wall that says they cannot contact their local legislator. Right? There's no wall that says you can't contact a journalist. You are perfectly free to write an email or call up and say, let me just provide you the evidence and do it nicely. I think you made a mistake here. Here's the actual evidence. Or to contact the legislator and just keep persisting and saying, I'm your constituent. I need you to meet with me. I need you to meet with me. And then to go in there with the facts and the figures, right? To have the information so you can hand them that in an accessible form, and what keeps every independent, unpaid activist from doing that? Oftentimes it's just a sense of feeling disempowered or feeling shy or whatever. But I'll tell you, one of the famous quotes is at Margaret Mead or something, all it takes to change the world is an individual. I can't remember exactly what the quote is of the person. But the fact of the matter is the individuals who are the most dedicated and creative and resourceful and willing to, not take no for an answer and to use their strengths, to engage. I mean, the fact of the matter is each little success like that, on an individual, an audience, a jurisdiction, it's what keeps you going.
Yeah. God, thank you. So I want to introduce Jeff Zamora here. So Jeff is the director of social media for INNCO, and it's kind of like if I'm the facilitator here, then Jeff is he's here to kick me into keeping this on track. And so I'm going to ask Jeff, do we have any question from the audience for Ethan?
Well, actually, there's a common concern and actually expressed by Mallory Gates, where she talks about how to deal with repetition when it comes to myth busting. And I'm pretty sure that on drugs, harm reduction is something that is still present to this day. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with repetition of myth busting?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, one of the things is that you sometimes think that one way that Ronald Reagan became the president of the United States was because he was an actor. And what that meant was that he was good at saying the same thing over and over and over, like 100,000 times, and always making it sound fresh each time. I, as a kind of professor, get bored of saying the same thing over and over, and I would constantly be changing it around. But Ronald Reagan had the right idea that just as the other side constantly repeats their things, we have to be ready to keep repeating our things over and over and over and over again as well. Now, that said, understand that many people incorrectly define advocacy as just standing up and saying what I believe, what I think, what I know, however I think I should say it. But, what we learned and what we sort of know instinctively is that doesn't help if it's not persuading anybody or if it's alienating people. It means that when you're out there, you need to be thinking about what are the specific words that I can use that will help move people on the other side. There was a point where we knew that saying legalize marijuana would alienate people. But if you said make it legal, drop that hard Z on legalize, you picked up your support from the public opinion. And if instead of saying the word legal at all, you just said, let's treat it like alcohol, tax control, regulate and educate, well, you got even more support. So figuring out the right language, the right tone, those are the sorts of things where we can keep coming back at the other. Look, right now, this is very much a David versus Goliath battle. And our opposition tries to paint the role of the tobacco companies, big tobacco, as making this about they're the David and that's the Goliath. But we know they're fucking lying. Right. We know that this whole advocacy movement for harm reduction basically, is essentially an unfunded movement at this point. Right. So what it means is it's just not engaging in the same repetition the other side does, but getting ever better at our languaging, trying to understand that framing in certain ways into certain audiences is more likely to prevail than is just saying what we believe. For me, the core principle of drug policy reform and harm reduction is that no one should be punished for what we put in our bodies if we don't hurt anybody else. That's the core principle. But I almost never lead with that principle. I lead with arguments that I know that people in the middle who don't care about my principle may embrace. And then maybe I pull my core principle of sovereignty and liberty and freedom at the end. But I don't lead with it.
Wow. So thank you so much, Ethan.